So again, welcome. Welcome once again to our second UDO virtual conversation on subdivision streets and infrastructure. Again, today covering the topics of required new streets and improvements and the associated standards for them. Some of you may have been at some of our previous engagements, but the presentation today will flow with staff giving an overview and a presentation on today's topic. We're going to ask that you, and it'd be great if you go ahead and get started on this now, take any opportunities during the course of the presentation to submit any questions or comments in the chat box so that we may see it. We have several subject matter experts here online with us that will try to attempt to answer your questions in real time as we go through our presentation. And then for any of those that we've not been able to address in the flow of the presentation, we'll go ahead and hopefully have some conversation time at the end to go ahead and address those unanswered questions and comments and have a little bit more discussion. So I'm going to go through very briefly some staff introductions for those of us that are joining on the call today. While I do this, if you would take the opportunity to go ahead and locate the chat function on your Zoom interface. And we'd ask that you introduce yourselves as well. If you would let us know what your name is and perhaps what neighborhood or organization that you may be representing and enter that in the chat, we'd appreciate that as well. So joining us today, along with myself, we've got Deputy Planning Director Allison Craig. We have got UDO Project Manager Laura Harmon. We have Deputy UDO Project Manager Alan Goodwin. We've got UDO team members Andrew Ossel, Yolanda Jones, Mariah Wozniak, Katie Burkett. There may be some, there's a lot of names on my screen. I may have missed someone. I can't tell if Sandy is here or not. We've got several integral core team SSI team members that have worked with myself and the UDO team in putting the SSI part of the UDO together. We've got Tracy Newsom with Charlotte Department of Transportation, along with her co-workers, Felix Obregon and Julian Burton. We've got our current subdivision administrator, Josh Weaver, with us as well. And John Howard from Charlotte Area Transit is with us. And I think we've got some folks on with Charlotte Water and some some land development folks as well. So thank you all for joining us. And I see we've got the chat flowing. I appreciate everybody getting those comments in. Thank you very much. So the purpose of today's meeting, again, is to talk about required new streets and improvements for them and the standards for them. Specifically, we're aiming to convey and help you guys learn when or if development triggers for new or improved streetscape occur. Learn where the standards, where you can find the standards for those improvements and how they will look and be built in the physical environment. And then also learn a little bit more about the process for how development may mitigate transportation impacts in and around projects. So if you've been with us before, this slide may be familiar, but I will say we've had some late breaking developments. So there is some new and updated information on this slide, which outlines our key UDO schedule dates. The first public draft of the UDO was released in October of 2021. Our public engagement, which we're currently engaged in and receiving comments on the first draft, has now been extended. Previously, this was from the release of the first draft in October through the middle of this month, January, but now that has been extended another 2 months. So we're going to be engaging with the public and welcoming comments on the first public draft now through March 18th, 2022. Subsequent to that, we'll be reviewing those comments and preparing a redlined second draft with revisions. We'll be doing that ongoing from now through May 2022 with a second UDO draft and a public hearing draft released in May. We are still seeking to have a city council public hearing on the draft UDO in June, along with a planning committee recommendation being sought, and still on target for a July 2022 UDO adoption. The UDO is broken out into several different topic areas. Some of those are listed on the screen. Today, we're going to be delving into and concentrating on the subdivision streets and other infrastructure portion of the UDO, which we have taken to internally here, calling it SSI. SSI is part 10 of the UDO, and it is broken out into 6 separate articles: an introductory article, an article covering the subdivision process, an article regarding network cross-access and driveway regulations, Article 33, which is going to be a large focus of today's meeting, having to do with required new streets and in transportation improvements. We're going to touch very briefly on Article 34, which is the standards for those streets, off-street public paths, and cross-access, and specifically where you can find them. And we previously covered a little bit about the last article encompassing other infrastructure. So with that, I'd like to turn over the presentation to a core SSI team member and our subdivision administrator, Josh Weaver, and he'll take you through the next couple of slides. Josh?
So in the city, there's 2 big buckets of streets. Those are mainly arterial streets and local and collector streets. Arterial streets, here you can see, have our parkways, boulevards, avenues, and main streets. And parkways are generally the higher auto-oriented streets, higher volume, higher speeds, and are the access is managed the most. Main streets are those streets that have more access, they're slower speeds and lower volume, and are more pedestrian-oriented types of streets, with avenues and boulevards falling somewhere in between. We also have collector and local streets, and those streets have historically been built by development and have been through the subdivision process. There's been a change in state law 160D, and that has expanded the applicability of when streets can be required. And so going forward, collector and local streets can be required through zoning review, not just through the subdivision process. And it could be when a principal building's been being constructed, or if that collector street's shown on the streets map as a corridor. If you were with us last time, we talked about when streets are required, and when a development comes in for review, that we start by extending stub streets that are along the perimeter of the property, and then we look at maximum and preferred block lengths to determine when additional streets are required. Historically, those block lengths have been based on zoning, but moving forward, place types, the block lengths will be tied more to place types to go along with the current UDO. With the UDO, we've also made adjustments to the regional activity center, maximum and preferred block lengths. We've adjusted manufacturing and logistics, and we've added preferred and maximum block lengths to parks and preserves. So here is the table of preferred block lengths that's proposed with the UDO. As you can see, regional activity centers is decreased to 400 feet from where it was at 500. Manufacturing and logistics actually increased to 800 from the preferred at 600 where it is now. And parks and preserves, the preferred block length will be 1,000 feet. We also, go ahead to the maximum. As we determine when streets are required, we look at the maximum block length to determine if more streets are required. And this table has also been adjusted with the UDO. The regional activity center decreased to 600 feet as a maximum. Manufacturing logistics increased to 1,500, and parks and preserves, the maximum will be 1,500. These are all used to help determine when streets are required through new development. We'll turn this over to Tracy.
There we go. Thanks, Josh, for that intro. Just want to kind of wrap up the new streets standards piece by just presenting this table of where the standards live in relation to the UDO. The streets map is something that is out for review as well, and is referenced in the UDO. And then we've got standards. Some standards are on the streets map and some standards are in the land development standards manual, depending on the type of street, and kind of along the lines of what Josh said about the different types of arterials, for example. So limited access roadways are shown on the streets map only from a locational perspective, just so people can see which ones are called limited access roadways. But the standards themselves are basically controlled for the most part by NCDOT. Arterial streets, those more major streets, sometimes called thoroughfares, the standards, not only the location, but the standards for the arterials are actually on the streets map, and that's spelled out in the UDO. Collectors some collectors are shown on the streets map, but not all of them, because as Josh pointed out, there are rules within the UDO about what types of streets become collectors, and so they wouldn't show on the streets map. So it's kind of a blend there. And the standards are in the land development standards manual. Local streets are not on the streets map at all, except in very rare circumstances, which I can describe later if we need to talk about that. But the standards are in the land development standards manual. So we just wanted to get this in front of y'all to see kind of how the different types of roadways and streets are apportioned in terms of where you find the standards. Next, please. So I'm going to walk through some of the information in the UDO at a high level about the requirements for improvements to existing streets. But before I get into that, it felt important to take a step back and make sure that we remind you that you can also review and comment on an important accompaniment to the UDO, and that's the streets manual. This is out. You can review and comment on that using either the QR code here or the link shown. And so we want to make sure that you're aware of that. And there are 3 components to the streets manual. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail on all of them, but 3 components include documentation about the content of the streets map to help describe the streets map. It includes driveway and access rules. This is essentially the driveway manual with some refinements, the current driveway manual with some refinements to include and to incorporate place type distinctions, and also to make sure that the parts that are now in the UDO related to driveways, which we talked about in December, that those come out. So we're trying to make sure that dovetails well with the UDO. Probably the biggest piece of the streets manual in terms of different information is this comprehensive transportation review, or CTR. And that is basically the modernized, updated edition or version of our more traditional traffic impact study. Could you go to the next slide? So I don't want to, it's not necessarily the purpose of the presentation today, but I want to make sure to walk through, because this piece, the comprehensive transportation review, the CTR guidelines, are really significant part of our new approach to modernize and update and align with our policy framework. So I want to just walk through briefly that. We currently use a traffic impact study to assess the impacts of developments on the transportation network, and then to apply mitigations to that. Typically, things that have to do with widening roads. We've known for some time that we need to update the approach and modernize the approach to better align with our policy framework. And so what I want to do is just briefly at a high level walk through kind of what we do now, or what the current TIS operates like, and what the updated CTR will be like. So the current approach to TIS is based solely on motor vehicle impacts. That's very traditional. The updated approach considers all modes. It considers walking and cycling and so forth. The traffic impact study that we're using was last updated in 2007. As I said, we've known for some time that we need to modernize, and so the CTR better aligns with the 2040 plan policy framework, as well as other more modernized policies that have been adopted in very recent years, like Charlotte Walks and Charlotte Bikes. So it's, again, this is an attempt to take something that was very traditional traffic impact study and modernize it to consider all modes. The current approach applies to conditional rezoning petitions, and there was also some language incorporated into the TOD ordinance that was adopted in 2019. Under the UDO, because the UDO is broader brush, the CTR applies to all UDO zoning districts. So it's a broad application, just as the UDO is. Under the current approach, there's kind of a one-size-fits-all approach to the process, but under the updated CTR, there's more of a context-based approach. So it recognizes that we've got over 300 square miles of a city that have a lot of different types of contexts. We've got a lot of more refined policy framework. And so the approaches aren't always going to be exactly the same. And then finally, under the current approach, really what you're talking about with mitigations is kind of a negotiated improvements. Under the CTR, there's actual, there's menus of improvements and mitigations for various of the assessments. And so we go from a negotiated improvement situation to one where it's more predictable, more transparent, and really a more consistent process. Even though it's context-based, the process itself is more consistent from one application to the other. Next, please. Just a little bit more detail on this. Again, there's a lot of detail in it, but just to kind of show how we've aligned our impact assessments with our policy framework. There are now 3 types of assessments that might be included as part of a CTR. The multimodal assessment is really about how you move people as opposed to cars. So it's talking about moving people. Transportation demand management component, or TDM, has to do with reducing single occupant vehicle trips. So there's more information in CTR about that. And then, of course, we know that we still have to look at traffic. We still have to look at congestion. We still have to consider that, particularly when you look at the different types of contexts we have around our city. And so there is still this traditional traffic impact study approach as well. The reason we have 3 types of assessments is we're really looking for context-based assessments and context-based mitigations. The idea is that by having more ways to assess, by having different types of mitigations, we can get the most appropriate outcomes based on the context of where a development is occurring and really the amount of development that's occurring on a site. And just to kind of wrap that part of this up, if you're in a high intensity district or place type, the focus of the assessments is going to be more on multimodal and transportation demand management types of improvements. Whereas if you're in a lower intensity district, there would probably be more of an emphasis. There will be more of an emphasis on motor vehicle improvements. So again, trying to get the right outcomes based on context. Another key piece of what we're doing with the CTR is that we're trying to make sure that the TIS itself is aligning with what NCDOT requires. And so to try to create a little bit more consistency across that. And then finally, we've updated the TIS thresholds, the traffic impact study thresholds, to better align with what our peer cities are doing and the needs of our growing city. And so really that's just kind of a high level overview of the CTR itself and of the streets manual. So I encourage you, if you haven't looked at that, to go online, look at it, provide your comments. We'll be accepting comments over the same time frame as the UDO is accepting comments. And so reach out. The CTR has had a separate engagement effort underway with folks who technically apply some of these types of assessments. And so reach out if you want to know more about that or would be interested in seeing that or commenting on that. Next slide, please. Okay, so Josh spent some time, and we spent some time last time that we talked about transportation in December, talking about new streets and the requirements for new streets. And want to focus here for a little bit on improvements to existing streets. So what happens when you've got existing streets that are not up to standard in some way? And so specifically, we're going to focus on curb and gutter and streetscape and what the UDO says about those. Streetscape, just for clarity, what we're talking about there is the sidewalk, or in some cases, a shared use path and then the space between that sidewalk and the street, which is either a planting strip, or in higher intensity locations, it might be an amenity zone, a hardscape zone. Typically, these areas have street trees as well. So that's what we're talking about. So we'll walk through at a high level some of the information that's in the UDO on those types of improvements. Just to kind of set the stage, the regulations and the information, the requirements that are in the UDO are really based on approaches that were developed as part of the TOD ordinance update in 2019. That served as kind of a pilot to how we might deal with certain types of improvement issues. And so it combines, melds together those types of approaches. And then it also brings in many existing requirements, for example, from Chapter 19 of the existing current city ordinance. And so it's kind of melds together the approach and the information, and then refines that information. And so the refinements are basically intended to reflect context, to be better, more context-based, based on the type of place you're in, and in some cases, differences between districts, and then the street type as well. Next, please. So let's first talk about curb and gutter on existing streets. What I'm going to do is just briefly walk through standards and dimensions, where you find that, kind of like what we did with the new streets piece just a moment ago. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the requirements when there is no existing curb and gutter on an existing street, and so what kind of requirements there are about adding curb and gutter. And then there's a new concept, and it's new as in quotes because it's really kind of an expansion and a clarification of a concept that is already used in some cases, and that's relocating existing curb and gutter. So when the existing curb and gutter is not in the location that it's going to ultimately be in, there's some rules about that. Next, please. So in terms of the curb and gutter standards, just basically to walk through, when we talk about the standard, we can talk about the design, what type of curb and gutter, and then we can also talk about the location of the curb and gutter. And so in terms of the design, SSI, that section 10 of the UDO that we lovingly call SSI, describes the type of curb that is required in certain circumstances. So is a valley curb allowable or not, for example? And then the CLDSM, the Land Development Standards Manual, provides the construction details on that, just as it does now. In terms of the location, part of the standard is that we need to be able to tell people easily where the location of the future back of curb is, because if you've looked at other parts of the UDO, there are some types of regulations that are made in relationship to that location. So for example, setbacks in a lot of places. So we need to say where you can find that information. For arterial streets, that information about future back of curb location is found on the streets map. As you can see in the diagram on the bottom, you can see that there is actually the dimension that says exactly where that future back of curb will be. For local and collector streets, that information is found in the Land Development Standards Manual diagrams, like the one on the lower right. Next, please. So in terms of adding curb and gutter, so when there's a street that doesn't have curb and gutter at all, there are basically rules and regulations about when curb and gutter would need to be added. And so I'm not going to go into each one of these in detail, but just to say it depends on what you're doing on your site, basically. And so all the way from whether you're doing a new subdivision to whether or not there might be a trigger that might require adding curb and gutter based on change of use, or what we're calling transportation intensive uses. I'll explain that term in just a few minutes as we go through these slides. So it depends on what's happening on site. And then there are exceptions. We know that there's always going to be some exceptions where we need to build in a little bit of flexibility. I'm not going to go into each one of these, but I will say that the first two of these bullet points are current exceptions. Those come directly from the current ordinance as well, that there are certain circumstances where you may not be required to add the curb and gutter, or you could actually contribute to a project. The latter two bullets under here are a little different. We've deliberately, purposely put language in about CDOT and NCDOT working together to determine whether curb and gutter would be required on an NCDOT maintained arterial or street, for example, or other type of roadway. Because, you know, often those streets are in areas where there may be some discussion about whether or not curb and gutter is appropriate. And then finally, lower intensity residential places and districts are exempt from adding curb and gutter to existing streets if it's not already there. Now, what about when there is existing curb and gutter, but it's not in that location, that standard location that's been defined? And so there is provision in the UDO for relocating the curb and gutter to that future location. This is a new concept in the sense that it is there, as you can see, it's currently applied sometimes through a traffic study or conditional rezoning or through some other type of approval. There are circumstances where the curb and gutter actually gets moved to accommodate, sometimes it's to accommodate a turn lane, for example, or in some instances a turn lane and a bike lane. And so there are current applications of this. The concept here is to take it to expand the potential application and to clarify when it would actually be required to actually relocate that curb and gutter. And you know, I'll describe a little bit more about that, but really this is about providing clarity and predictability so that as we incrementally improve streets, it's very clear when the curb would need to be relocated and when it wouldn't. It gives us a more systematic approach to kind of continue building out our multimodal street network, and ultimately, along with the projects that we do as part of capital projects in our CIP, that gets us the multimodal streets that our policies are requiring of us. And so this would be about moving curb to provide space for the bike facilities and to fill in the bike network, to provide center space that provides for safer turning movements for vehicles or safer crossing opportunities for pedestrians, for example. Next, please. So in terms of the application and the rules around relocating curb and gutter, just right off the top, I told you some of the circumstances in which it would be considered currently, but as the UDO applies across the board, this regulation or this requirement might apply to by right development as well. And so that's why we've established the rules to show when it would and wouldn't occur. The rules are scaled to reflect the project and the location. So in other words, we would look at, you know, if you look at the language, you'll see that it depends on what you're doing on your site. What is the level of development or a change that a development is creating on a site? And what is the context? You know, what kind of place is the development occurring in and what's the street type? And so, for example, based on this, if you're doing a large development in an intense place type along an arterial, you're more likely to be required to move the curb and gutter than if you're doing a small development in a low intensity place along a collector, for example. So it's scaled to accommodate those differences. It also, these requirements look at how much street frontage is affected. And so we have a tool in there of the block length to be able to create a kind of a consistent tool, a consistent gauge to calibrate how much street frontage is affected by a development and whether it makes sense then to require the curb to be moved. Next, please. I won't go into each one of these, but even with the rules set up and in place and kind of established to try to create that kind of sliding scale of applicability, we understand that there are unique circumstances and case-by-case instances where there might need to be an exception. I won't necessarily go through each of these. The funded CIP project is a very common exception for these requirements, which is essentially saying that if there's a capital project that's going to be built that would move the curb, the development wouldn't necessarily have to move the curb. They might contribute to that project. There are exceptions related to if there are existing heritage trees or existing stands of mature trees that might be affected by moving the curb in the interim. There's an exception for that. If there's stormwater or drainage issues that are going to make that can't be solved and would make moving that curb create worse circumstances, there's exceptions for that. So there's also modification criteria. So this is one where, that maybe the requirement would be waived, maybe it would be modified, but there are rules in place to allow us to walk through that discussion. I think a key point of this is that this doesn't necessarily override the future curb location from the streets map. It simply says in the interim, you don't necessarily have to relocate the curb and gutter to that location. So all of the other standards that deal with future location from the streets map, future curb location from the streets map would still apply in the same way. Next, please. Okay, so that's, that's the information on curb and gutter. Obviously, you've got the language. You can look through if you have additional questions. Reach out or submit them. But we also need to talk about streetscape. And again, we're going to walk through it in a similar way. We're going to talk about standards and dimensions for streetscape, and we're going to talk about what the requirements are around adding streetscape where it doesn't exist on an existing street. So for example, the bottom two left photos. Or then we'll talk about updating the substandard streetscape when you've got streetscape that is far off of the current standard, when it might be required to update that. Next, please. So in terms of standards and dimensions, the first statement probably sounds a little weird. The streetscape will always be behind the future backup curb, and that goes to that streets map location to say that it's going to be, the streetscape will be put in the right location, whether or not the curb gets moved. That's really what that's saying. The sidewalk standards and dimensions are context-based. You can see in this table, I hope you can see it. I don't know how large it's showing on your screen, but you've got street types that you would look at, and then whether or not you're in a lower or a higher intensity place type. And so for most arterials, if you're in a lower intensity place type, you're going to have either a 6-foot sidewalk or a 12-foot shared use path in some more suburban types of locations. In higher intensity place types, you're more likely to have an 8-foot sidewalk or a shared use path in rare circumstances where those make sense in a higher intensity place. On a main street, which as Josh pointed out earlier, is our most pedestrian oriented type of street, the sidewalk would be 10 feet. Locals and collectors, again, based on whether you're low intensity or high intensity, are going to be either 6 or 8 feet. I think this is an important point. This is different and new, is that the minimum width citywide of sidewalks is 6 feet in the UDO, as opposed to some streets in the current ordinance can be 5 feet, so 5-foot sidewalks. Planting strip or amenity zone, again, that's that space between the street and the sidewalk. There is a standard dimension of 8 feet in most cases. There are some exceptions to that, and we can talk a little bit about that in a minute. But whether or not it is a planting strip with grass and street trees or an amenity zone with a hardscaped surface and street trees is based on the place type and whether or not there's on-street parking along that street. So again, an attempt to create a very context-based type of streetscape for the dimensions. Next, please. So in terms of when streetscape is required, when some sort of change to the streetscape is required, I'm going to talk about general applicability rather than talking about it from the standpoint of adding versus updating, because you can see that there's a whole list of types of on-site actions that could affect whether or not streetscape is required to be touched in any way. Going from all the way from a full-scale subdivision down to some types of activities that could occur for an individual parcel. And so rather than walk through each of those, I'll just say that when, there's general applicability when you talk about subdivision or new principal structures, and the rest of these actions are scaled to whether or not there's no existing sidewalk or whether or not there is existing but substandard sidewalk. I think a key point here is, once again, we have exceptions here. Most development in one place types, for example, is exempted from the streetscape requirements. Next, please. So this term has been used in a couple of those on-site action lists, this idea of a transportation intensive uses. This is a new concept introduced in the UDO. if you look at change of use, and you go back, for example, to the TOD ordinance and even further, change of use in the UDO is defined as a change from one major land use category to another. So for example, going from an industrial category to a commercial category. And so that carries with it expectations or changes in terms of regulations. But from the standpoint of something like streetscape, it doesn't really account for changes that might occur within one of those broad categories. So for example, you could have a car repair facility that becomes a bar or a restaurant. And so those have different expectations in terms of the people's ability to walk to them, for example, or the expectation that you're going to have more visits and arriving by different modes, for example. And so we've introduced the concept of transportation intensive uses, which are specific uses that would, even within categories, that would potentially trigger the need to improve the streetscape or curb and gutter. Not always. There's still going to be the exemptions and the, and the scaled triggers. But this is just a concept that is kind of also built into the UDO as a potential trigger. Next. So we've talked a little bit about, what kind of requirement was going to kick in for actually adding sidewalks where none exist. There's also provision in the UDO for updating substandard sidewalks or streetscape, like the one on the right, where you've got, maybe a very narrow sidewalk located right at the back of curb next to travel lanes. So there's information in there about the requirements for information in SSI about when it would be required to update substandard streetscape. Lights just went off. I don't know if you can still see me. I didn't move enough apparently. So these substandard streetscape, updating substandard streetscape, the rules that are in the UDO are really a hybrid of existing ordinance from our current chapter 19 of the city ordinance, and some approaches that were introduced as part of the TOD, or the transit oriented development ordinance that was adopted in 2019. These standards have been joined together and refined to reflect all place types. So to create a context-based application for all places. And really, just like some of the other standards we've talked about, whether or not a development has to update a substandard streetscape depends on what's happening on the site, how much development is occurring, what kind of change is occurring, how much of it, and how substandard the streetscape is. How bad is it, basically, compared to the standard. These rules apply if either the sidewalk or the planting strip is substandard. And so really that's to make sure that we don't perpetuate these back of curb sidewalks like in the picture here. So in order to refine it to reflect all place types, you'll see that the language in the UDO says that substandard is defined as if the sidewalk or shared use path is more than 2 feet less than it should be in width. That's a little awkward, but it's basically saying, is it within 2 feet? If it's within 2 feet of the standard, that's okay. If it's not within 2 feet of the standard, that is not okay. And then the planting strip uses the same rule and basically says if it's less than 6 feet. Next, please. So again, in terms of streetscape, there are rules spelled out in the ordinance that explain when streetscape would need to be added or modified. But as with the other requirements, we understand that there are circumstances where that make direct application difficult. And so there are opportunities to modify those standards or the requirement to do it. Again, there's very similar language for many of the requirements in SSI. I think a couple of things to point out here is that there is provision to modify the standard or the requirement for tree preservation for heritage trees or large stands or significant stands of mature trees, and for constrained space, like on the lower right, the picture on the lower right, where you might have an existing building and you really don't have the space to create that streetscape. What we've tried to do in the UDO is to provide the adequate guidance to basically say, in the situation where you, because of trees or constrained space, you can't do exactly what the standard is, there's guidance in there about how to solve for that. And so that's very good, so that it's not a case by case trying to figure it out. There's information to help guide that discussion. Finally, I think as we've walked through, I've tried to point out that, both in terms of triggers, thresholds, modifications, and exceptions, there's a fair amount of flexibility built into the requirements to try to make sure that we're context-based and we're actually getting the right improvements in the right location. There is also a section in the UDO, in SSI, called transportation adjustments that basically says there are some standards that may be adjusted based strictly on whether or not they are proportional to the development that's occurring. And so there can be some flexibility as well granted for proportionality. And that's really to try to figure out, okay, what would be the proportional application of the standard. And so that's decided by, there's a table that says, which director decides that, and then there's appeals can go to the Board of Adjustment for that. So this is just, another layer of being able to make sure that we're being flexible and making sure we're meeting the context and what's actually happening on the site. And I think with that, I'll pass this over to John Howard with CATS.
Thank you, Tracy. I only have a couple of slides to walk through. This is the end of the presentation, but this relates to CAT services and bus stops and amenities related to that. And the purpose is to maintain and improve access to CATS services along existing bus routes. The first bullet here, it talks about updating our existing stops to meet ADA standards. If you look on the picture on the top right, you'll see that some stops around the city don't have a sidewalk or a waiting pad at that location. So with a new development, we would want to ensure that we get that stop improved to meet ADA standards. And also for new CATS bus stops, again, this applies to non-residential, mixed-use, multifamily, and townhouse development if it's located along existing bus route on our transit service plan, and also if it meets a minimum number of daily vehicular trips. And also if a stop is located outside of maybe a quarter mile, we would request that. So the last bullet basically states that it's not required if a stop is already within that quarter mile, but if it's outside of that quarter mile on the same side of the street, then we will want to see a new stop constructed at that location. And as far as the development standards, we do have those within the current Charlotte Land Development Standards Manual, and they do apply to both CATS maintained stops and also non-CATS maintained amenities. And that ranges anything from a simple waiting pad with a ADA ramp and maybe a space for a trash receptacle to a pad that can host a bus shelter, bike rack, and other things. So depending on the site, depending on where it is and the context and the development density, it could either range from a simple concrete pad, as you see here on the bottom right within the planning strip, or it could also accept a transit shelter for a larger development. Some exceptions to that are steep slopes. Sometimes we're not able to construct that depending on the slope of the site behind the curb.
To make sure that these kinds of areas we're looking more closely.
There we go. If it's at an intersection where you have site distance conflicts, or if there's simply unsafe conditions for the transit system to operate, or for pedestrian conflicts. So those are the exceptions. There may be more, but those are the general exceptions to constructing these facilities. And the same applies for, again, for non-CATS bus stops and amenities. So there's consistency within both CATS and for non-CATS maintained bus stops and amenities. And with that, I will hand it back over to Kevin.
Thanks, John. I appreciate that. Excuse me. So that concludes kind of the substantive pieces of today's discussion. So just want to give you a few wrap-up slides. First, I want to put a plug out there for everybody to visit our UDO project website at www.charlotteudo.org. There you can submit your questions and comments regarding the first draft of the UDO, and also find additional information, including scheduling, upcoming meetings, supporting documents, and some frequently asked questions as well. Additionally, even for us here that have been dealing with it for quite some time, the UDO can be quite the burdensome document to try to get through. As such, as we've gone out and tried to engage the community with this, we've created a handy reference guide that provides a more easy to understand reference point for the first draft of the UDO, and tries to help you find the information on specific topics of interest in or the zoning districts, including some explanations of some of the new regulatory concepts that the city is working on through the Unified Development Ordinance Project. Again, on the first draft, it was released in October of 2021. We have been engaging in community activities and discussions from the release of that first draft through this month, and we will continue to do so. As I stated earlier, comments for the first draft, that comment period has now been extended from ending this month through and being extended to accept comments on the first draft through March 18th, 2022. And again, to be able to do that, you can visit our website at charlotteudo.org to find the draft, their sections, and submit comments and questions. And then here, we're coming to the end of our current phase of engagement with our virtual conversations, though I will say we did have a frequent users Q&A that was originally scheduled for Tuesday, January 4th, that has now been rescheduled to January 27th. So we still have one more on this first phase of virtual conversations taking place. If you'd like to attend that frequent users Q&A meeting, you can register for that event by scanning the QR code here or registering as you did for this workshop. All of our discussions to this point have focused on really very specific topics. That frequent user session is going to drill down a little bit more specifically into some questions submitted by those that kind of deal with the unified development and its provisions on a daily basis. Our conversations take place 2 times a day when they're scheduled for 1 hour from noon to 1, and then additionally on the same day at the same topic from 6 to 7. And as I said, you can register as you did for this workshop or scanning that QR code or visiting our website at charlotteudo.org. We did have a few questions submitted during registration for this afternoon's virtual conversation. And the first one here that was submitted was, how do we get better street lighting, streetscapes, and line markings on every road? And so I'm going to, it seems to be very streets kind of maintenance to some extent oriented type of question. So I'm going to ask my friends and partners over at CDOT if they can provide some insight on this question.
I don't know. I moved locations, so I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So on this question, I don't know if this is a general, I'd kind of like to hear from whoever submitted it, whether they're talking generally or whether they're talking about specifically how it's referenced in the UDO itself. But just generally speaking, for either street lighting or substandard streetscapes, and even if there are line markings that are being worn on certain streets, you would submit that to 311 and let us know that. And then we would go out and assess the lighting. And there are basically sometimes projects to improve streetscapes. There's a process for requesting that. Typically line markings, the pavement markings are updated when repaving occurs, which is on a given cycle. But if there's somewhere where someone's really having an issue where they feel like it's very worn, then please do submit that to 311 and we would assess that.
Perfect. Thank you, Tracy. I think I'm not seeing the attendee that submitted that here with us, but we can follow up with that person as we may need. A second question submitted was, how is urban heat mitigation factored into the design of new amenities? Does this have an equity focus? Does anybody have anything they'd like to say about that? And if not, we can always, if it's a little bit outside of the scope of today's meeting, we can always circle back up with this this person submitting this question. Let's put a pin in this one for now for the sake of the ongoing conversation. Now, the last question we had prior is, what is the plan to increase the canopy around new and improved streets? There's actually two questions here, and let's take that first portion first. So I think that question is probably best addressed. Let me throw this to one of my teammates, Andrew, also, who has worked with the natural resources and trees part of the UDO. Andrew, if you're with us, can you share a little bit about trees in the kind of along street corridors?
Yeah, I'll do the best I can. I will say that we did a whole presentation on the trees article. So if you missed that one, we talked a little bit about tree planting. The streets articles will sort of spell out in I'm not exactly sure where, but when a planting strip for trees along streets are required. And I believe the width and sort of all that is in the streets chapter. And so the tree article of the UDO has standards for the size of tree that needs to be planted in that planting strip, the frequency in terms of how many trees per, I think it's basically the spacing of those trees, whether it's 30 feet spacing or 40 feet spacing between each tree. But the tree article does maintain standards for planting street trees in instances of new development, and we call them perimeter trees sometimes. So you see the term perimeter tree or street tree, that's what we're talking about in the article. It'd be Article 29. So in terms of what's required and how it's going to help with the canopy along our streets, anytime that there is a new development, and there are obviously some better definition of what that means in the articles, but anytime there is new development, they are required to plant street trees. So hope that helps. Hope that gets at the question. I don't know if anybody wants to elaborate more on the CDOT side.
Well, I'll elaborate a little bit, Andrew, and just to say that it's the canopy issue is one that's being looked at from a couple of different and through a couple of different lenses in the UDO, right? You've kind of tied it back to the topic of today's discussion, which is streets and where planting strips or space for trees might be required, and then you've also mentioned where development occurs, if there's this, if that planting strip is required, that there would be a, separate requirement to determine how many number of those perimeter trees need to be along those projects. And then also, I think in SSI, we're looking at perhaps different ways to which existing canopy, although it's not increasing, it's maybe a little bit preserving in the street corridors. We're also looking at how maybe we could better preserve when there are conflicts that canopy. So maybe trees are preserved more than they are removed. So not necessarily increasing, but at least preserving as well. And then the second half, thank you for that, Andrew. The second half of that question was, will recycling receptacles be placed with trash cans? And candidly, I'm going to say, I don't know that we've got a good answer for that. John, are there any current requirements in the bus stop details that require trash cans be installed with, full stop amenities?
We do have one that does not require a receptacle, but the rest of them do. And we're updating our our standards now. So I think moving forward, probably most of them will have that extra width in there, but right now we do have one that does not require that.
Great. Thanks for that answer. And John, and just to circle back to our second question, I see Jennifer Roberts in the chat stated that she had asked that question, and certainly Jennifer, like if myself or another team member can find you, be more than happy to hear what you have to say with regard to that question, but I am not. Team, if any of you are seeing, oh, I see you now. I just asked you to unmute Jennifer, or see if you can do that. And maybe you can give some context to your question.
Yeah, great. I was just typing in the chat as well. But there are parts of our city that are 10 degrees hotter in the summer because of historic disinvestment and climate injustice. And I'm just wondering if there are any considerations. Some cities are actually using lighter street materials, painting some streets white to help reduce urban heat, and looking at it from an equity lens. And I didn't know if that was, part of any of our consideration for street design. As climate change worsens, we're going to get hotter and hotter in the summer, and trees are great. They take a while to grow. And so I just didn't know if there was any surface consideration for different materials, trellises. There are lots of things that cities are doing that are very innovative. Just wondered.
Sure. And, I probably don't have a real satisfactory answer for you on that. I think some of those are really great ideas. Some of that I think probably would have to be discussed with some of the land development folks that look at the construction details for our streets and our corridors to talk about some of those maybe alternative methods that you talked about. And then some of it, I think, is just a little bit beyond the scope of what we do with the UDO, and the regulatory language talks a little, it's a little bit more policy oriented. But happy to hear the feedback and the comments. And we've got a lot of essential teammates on here. So hopefully they'll take that feedback and those comments under consideration as they move forward with all of the projects that we're working on, the UDO included. But unfortunately, Jennifer, I just don't know that, in the framework of a regulatory document that we can address some of those higher level or policy oriented questions. I've been trying desperately. I know we're a little bit past. We've got the opportunity to extend this just a little bit longer. I've not had an opportunity to keep track with the chat and where we are on that. Is there somebody with our team that can help me figure out? Is there something we need to circle back to and revisit?
Kevin, it seems as though the chat has been kept up. I don't think we've missed any questions at this point, except for we just had a couple come in, 101 and 102.
Okay. Nancy Wiggins, I see your comment. Thank you. We will take that under consideration. So hearing that our chat is mostly kept up, except for some of the things currently trickling in. We've got one last one from Dr. Sylvia Biddle-Patton. How will this article work in concert with existing PED overlay elements that already exist in adopted approved area plans? Laura Allen, this is very zoning oriented. Can either of you help Dr. Biddle-Patton with that answer? All right, Dr. Biddle-Patton, we'll get back to you. We've got your question recorded, and we will respond back with an answer to that question. We have told our, yep.
I'm sorry. I was having a hard time getting to unmute. Let me just try to answer that. There is, to be perfectly honest, there isn't a direct connection, though we think that many of the standards in our zoning districts, and that's for the new zoning districts in the UDO, will be very similar to what was in those area and PED plans, but we're not referencing those. Instead, we're referencing the Charlotte Streets map and the frontage types for determining setbacks and curb locations.
Thank you, Laura. I'm sorry I almost stepped on you and cheated you the opportunity to respond, but I'm glad we were able to get Dr. Biddle Patton's answer to her in real time. We have now told our time and even had some additional fun. So just wrapping up, I want to say thank you to everybody for being here at this afternoon's discussion. Maybe we'll see some of you later. And please don't forget, for all your questions and comments, visit our website to submit those via our UDO portal. Have a good rest of your day.